Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and we're back for a brand new season of looking at more of these old school vintage race bikes. And I do hope you enjoyed everything that I posted last year, but we do have some interesting projects to show you in 2023. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then I do hope you will do that very small thing, and of course that way you won't miss out on any future videos that I post here on YouTube. So as I said, a brand new season, so we're going to kick things off with our first video posting of the year. So let's get right into that video and take a look at this 1964 Swedish made Headland 500. So hello again once more, and welcome back to a brand new season here on Classic Dirt Bike TV as we check out our very first vintage classic of 2023. So this featured bike here is a 1964 Swedish built Headland 500, and this is yet another bike from the Peter Hollinshead collection. And you may remember that we showcased Peter's lovely 500 Lito on my channel back in 2022. But these short clips here are just a few shots that I captured when Peter's machine was sitting on display at the Drumlanrig Castle event in 2022. Now, with regards the actual Headland motorcycle company, I'd have to be quite truthful here. I do know very little about them, but after a bit of research, I did just about manage to dig up a few details about these intriguing motorcycles. So it's said that the origins of the Headland Motorcycle Company date way back to 1955, when Niels Hedlund, or Niels Olof Hedlund, to give him his full name, was just a young engine tuner who lived in Stockholm in Sweden. And it was Niels and another very talented engineer by the name of Gunnar Hagström who began then producing 500cc motocross engines for the company. Now, Niels Hedlund was also one of the engineers who played a big part in the development of the Lito brand of 500cc four-stroke Swedish machines, and this example here is one of those very rare Lito bikes, which also belongs to Peter Hollinshead. Although the main reason that Niels Hedlund got involved in this Lito and Headland projects was because that he had a vast knowledge of these big Albin four-stroke motors that powered them. Now, Niels Hedlund did continue to build engines during the early 1960s, and some of those were supplied to the Husqvarna motocross team at that time, but then Husqvarna stopped manufacturing big single-cylinder motors in 1963, which of course then left their top rider, Rolf Tiblin, without a machine for that forthcoming 1964 racing season. And so then Tiblin teamed up with Niels Hedlund, and between them they both built and developed this lovely Headland 500 bike for 1964. But this bike's owner, Peter Hollinshead, did tell me that this was one of the few bikes that Headland actually built when he was still in his 20s. So even at that very young age, Headland was already producing very competitive motocross race bikes. Although, as I said, I'm certainly no expert on these Headland bikes, because just like the Lito 500s of that same period, very few of these bikes were ever produced, and in fact original 500 Litos were said to be limited to just 35 machines. And so with regards the bike's frame or chassis, I just haven't a clue as to its manufacture, but I suspect that it would either be maybe a Monarch or possibly even a Husqvarna chassis, because Headland's expertise at that time was in designing and building these big four-stroke power plants, and for the early 1960s these were certainly big bruisers of an engine, and it certainly took a certain kind of rider to tame them. Although essentially these were a big single cylinder four-stroke with a double overhead cam top end and just a straight through big bore exhaust pipe that never had a muffler at the end of its tailpipe. But I also heard that Headland did try to get this motor accepted as a speedway engine, and you can see exactly why, because this motor had tons of torque and it would have been absolutely perfect for a speedway application. So moving on to some of the parts of this 500 engine. Now the magneto for the sparks, it was said, was powered off of one of the camshafts on the top of the engine, and this then had a separate HT coil and condenser to the spark plugs that you can see just underneath the fuel tank there. But the engineering in these big four-stroke singles is simply first class, and for such a young mechanical engineer, Hedlund certainly knew how to build a motocross engine. But naturally, on such a big long stroking motor, you need a decompressor to help you get that motor fired into life, because I expect that these engines did take a bit of kicking to get them started, and you'd certainly need a hefty boot on this Kickstarter to get that motor turning over. But the guys that rode these big singles back in the day were certainly made of stern stuff, and what their bikes lacked in the suspension department they certainly made up for in brute power, which of course this Headland motor had in absolute bucket loads. So once again, according to my research, these big Headland 500s used a BSA gearbox to transmit the power to that back wheel. But for 1960s, these BSA gearboxes were used on a multitude of different motorcycles in that time, so it wasn't only motocrossers that used them, it was various other types of road bikes as well. And also for the early 1960s, I'm pretty sure that it would have been a dry clutch on these big Headland motors that was connected to the crankshaft by way of a primary chain, and this nicely sculpted alloy cover would certainly keep any dust and dirt from entering those transmission workings. But as I said, a big bore straight through exhaust on these Headland power plants, certainly no muffler or silencer to drone out that fantastic sound from the big single cylinder engine. But this part was basically just one single pipe that had a couple of mounting points, one here on the front down tube and one at the rear just behind the gearbox. But as I said, a simple design, but it certainly sounded good when that big 500 motor got fired up. And so to keep that big 500 motor fed with its fuel, we had a PHM Delorto carburetor that allowed fuel to flow like the proverbial waterfall into that 500 cylinder block, because these big singles certainly did like a drink, and they could certainly swallow gas at an alarming rate. But I'm not entirely sure, but I think that most of these motocross Headland engines just ran on regular gas, while I think the speedway versions preferred the much more popular methanol. And also just behind the carburetor we had the engine's airbox, all housed in this custom-made alloy construction, and just sitting below the airbox was the motor's oil tank for the engine's oil lubrication. And as you can see, this was all beautifully made and had the feed pipes and return pipes to the motor where the oil would be pumped around the engine and then back to this storage tank. And a tank filler and breather cap was also added to this left hand side of that alloy storage tank. Although the grunt that was supplied from these Headland 500s was pretty awesome, and they more than likely had much more torque than you could ever handle, but these were the golden days of these big massive 4-stroke singles of the early 1960s, when of course it was a hardy breed of pilots who raced them, and in the following years it wouldn't be too long before riders were then turning to the much lighter and much more nimble 2-stroke scramblers. And having an alloy fuel tank on your motocross bike in the early 1960s was pretty much a standard fitting, because lighter fiberglass or plastic items were still a few years away and yet to be discovered as an alternative to alloy. But again, our superbly engineered aluminium fuel cell has been custom made to fit this bike's chassis, and just on the top there we have the Monza style locking fuel cap with the N and H emblem for Niels Hedlund. But plenty chrome, steel and nice shiny alloy was, as I said, a stock part of many of these old 60s scramblers, and the use of alloy for their fuel tanks and side panels and front and rear mudguards was pretty much the norm for that period. But our Headland here certainly looks the part with its rear mudguard all highly polished up. So as we move on to the bike's front suspension, which to tell you the truth, I don't really have a clue as to its origins or manufacture, but they certainly look like they could maybe be a pair of Italian Serianis, but of course don't quote me on that particular fact. But the bike's front and rear brake hubs are without doubt Czechoslovakian CZ parts, which again were very common on some of these Headlands from that period, because for their time these CZ brakes were quite good stoppers for old school technology, and for an older drum brake system these CZ parts certainly performed very well. And again, the bike's rear hub once more was a CZ part, as per of course the front brake. Now this rear item was another quite good stopper for its day, and this is more than likely the reason that these CZ hubs and brakes are still being used to this day when someone's putting together a custom or restored twin shock race bike. Although as we take a look at the back end of our Headland 500, now I've certainly no idea at all what rear suspension system Niels Hedlund would have bolted on to these bikes back in 1964, but the chances are that they would have been probably just a pretty basic spring and damper type affair, which as you can see is now long gone on our particular machine, and these have been replaced with these much better quality Hedlund shocks, which are also made here in the UK. Although with the limited amount of travel these old 60s scramblers had at the rear end, you'd think that the manufacturers would have added a bit more padding to the bike seat just to try and help compensate for that lack of suspension movement. But having said that, the guys who rode these machines back in the day, as I said, were without doubt tough as old boots, and more than likely is the reason why they spent most of their time on the track standing up on the pegs. But that's the great thing about attending these kind of classic or vintage race weekends. You just never know what you're going to come across walking around the paddock. And this featured Headland 500 belonging to Peter Hollinshead is certainly another rare breed, because you're not going to come across many 500 Headlands on your travels, mostly because very few of these bikes were actually made, and you can see that these Headlands are superbly engineered and take us all back to that fantastic time when these big four-strokes ruled the world's racetracks during those golden years of the magical 1960s. Well, I hope you enjoyed that look around that lovely Swedish-made Hedlund 500. Certainly a bike that you never ever see on racetracks these days, and that's quite a rare example there, belonging, of course, to Peter Hollinshead. So coming up next here on CDB, our second video posting of 2023 will be this very nice little Serco 250 Triumph, and this is a bike that I came across quite recently, so we'll be having a close look at this little scrambler when we return for my next video posting here on my channel. But as I keep saying, do be safe out there when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again for our second video posting of 2023, when we all return to your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.